The wind screamed like a dying thing. That's the only sound Sarah had heard for 3 days. The wind, the crackle of the fire, and the soft breathing of her little girl, Emma. Outside, the Colorado winter of 1876 was trying to claw its way into their tiny cabin, burying them under a mountain of white. 3 months since she'd buried her husband, James. 3 months of being utterly alone. Then came a new sound. Thump. 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 It wasn't the wind. It was a fist. Someone was at the door. Fear, cold and sharp, shot through her. No one came this high up the mountain, not in a blizzard that had swallowed the whole world. She grabbed James's rifle from above the mantel. The cold steel was heavy, unfamiliar in her hands. She crept to the door, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice barely a whisper. A man's voice answered, deep and rough, but strained. "Shelter. From the storm." Just 4 words, but they were almost lost in the howl of the wind. A traveler, lost. Her Christian upbringing told her to open the door. The hard-won wisdom of the frontier told her to shoot through it. A woman alone with a child was a target. "State your business," she demanded, trying to sound stronger than she felt. "I am Cold Fox. Of the Ute people. I mean no harm. A Ute warrior." Sarah's mind raced. The Ute kept to themselves, mostly. But tensions with settlers were getting worse every day. Still, leaving a man to die in this storm felt like a sin she couldn't carry. She took a deep breath, slid the bolt, and opened the door just a crack. He was a giant of a man, his shoulders covered in a thick layer of snow. Long dark hair whipped across a face marked with faint traditional lines. But his eyes, they were what held her. They were exhausted, desperate. He looked like he was about to collapse. And then he did. He stumbled forward, falling to his knees right on her doorstep. That's when she saw the dark stain spreading across the buckskin on his right leg. A deep, ugly red against the pristine white snow. He wasn't just cold, he was hurt. Badly. She hesitated for only a second. "Get inside," she said, her voice firm. She helped him over the threshold and slammed the door, shutting out the screaming wind. He slumped against the wall, leaving a smear of red on the floorboards. Her floorboards. He was breathing hard, his face pale beneath his weathered skin. "The barn. You said I could—" "You'll bleed to death in the barn," she cut him off. "Let me see the leg." She knelt, her hands trembling slightly as she pushed aside the torn fabric. It wasn't a clean cut. Not from a branch or a rock. This was a ragged, brutal gash, deep and angry. It looked like an animal trap had snapped shut on him. "A trap. For animals," he grunted, as if reading her mind. His grimace told her more than his words. She retrieved her small medical kit. It was mostly just herbs, clean rags, and a bottle of whiskey James kept for emergencies. This qualified. As she began cleaning the wound, he watched her, his expression a mask of stoicism. "What brings you so far from your people's hunting grounds?" she asked, trying to fill the tense silence. His dark eyes flickered toward the fire. "I was returning from a meeting. With your white officials." The way he said it, "your white officials," created a chasm between them right there on her cabin floor. "They make promises about our land. They are always making promises." She found the source of the bleeding. A jagged piece of metal was still embedded deep in his calf. It wasn't from a hunting trap. She'd seen those. This was different. Thicker. Sharper. It looked like a piece of shrapnel, or something intentionally cruel. She pulled it out with a pair of pliers, and he let out a sharp hiss of breath, his only sign of pain. She held the metal fragment up to the firelight. It was a piece of steel, crudely fashioned into a jagged tooth. This wasn't designed to catch an animal. It was designed to maim a man. The story about the animal trap was a lie. "Mama?" A small voice came from the bedroom doorway. Emma stood there, rubbing the sleep from her eyes, her rag doll clutched in one hand. Her eyes went wide as she saw the stranger by their fire. "Who is that?" "Go back to bed, sweetie," Sarah said, her voice tight, but Emma was already captivated. She took a few steps closer. "Are you a real Indian?" she asked, her voice full of a child's unfiltered curiosity. "Emma!" Sarah scolded. The man's harsh expression softened just a little. A rare smile touched his lips. "I am called Cold Fox, little one. And yes, I am of the Ute people." His gaze met Sarah's over the top of Emma's head. In that moment, a silent understanding passed between them. He had lied to protect her from a truth she might not be ready for. And now, with her daughter standing right there, she couldn't press him. She finished stitching the wound, her movements quick and efficient. The storm outside raged, shaking the very logs of the cabin. It was clear no one was going anywhere. "You can sleep by the fire," she said, her voice flat. "But at first light, you must be on your way." He nodded. "You have my word." As she tucked Emma back into bed, the little girl whispered, "Is he a good Indian or a bad Indian, Mama?" Sarah looked at the man sitting by her fire, a stranger with secrets bleeding out onto her floor. "There are good and bad people everywhere, Emma," she whispered back. "We'll just have to wait and see." She didn't know then that the blizzard was only the beginning. The real storm was already inside her cabin, and the piece of metal she'd pulled from his leg wasn't just a random fragment. It was a message, a warning. And it meant that whoever had hurt him was probably still out there, somewhere in the snow, hunting him. And now, they were hunting them too. For 3 days, the world was nothing but white. The blizzard didn't just continue, it intensified, burying them so deep it felt like they were in a grave. The snow piled up past the windows, sealing them in. The path outside was gone, the mountains were gone, everything was gone, and Cold Fox was still there. It was impossible for him to leave. To send him out into that swirling vortex of ice and wind would be a death sentence, and Sarah couldn't bring herself to do it. So he stayed. A silent, watchful presence by her hearth. He was useful, she had to admit. He split what was left of their firewood with a brutal efficiency that made the axe sing. He showed her how to brace the barn door against the crushing weight of the snowdrifts. He moved with a quiet purpose, never wasting emotion, even with his injured leg. But the silence between them was as thick as the snow outside. He was a puzzle she couldn't solve. Who shoots a man and leaves him for dead in the mountains? Why did he lie about the trap? The questions circled in her mind, unanswered. Their food supply was dwindling at an alarming rate. What was meant to last for one woman and a small child was now being shared 3 ways. She found herself cutting the bread into thinner slices each day. "I will not be a burden," he said one afternoon, his voice startling her. He was watching her measure out the flour, his eyes missing nothing. "When the storm breaks, I will hunt." "Hunt what?" she scoffed, a bit more harshly than she intended. "The whole world is buried." "There is always food," he said, his voice calm and certain. "For those who know where to look. The elk move to the lower valleys. The rabbits make tunnels under the snow. The land provides." He seemed to possess a knowledge as old as the mountains themselves. That evening, he proved it. Emma, growing bolder, had started following him around the small cabin. She pestered him with questions until he finally sat her down by the fire. "My people tell stories when the world sleeps under the snow," he told her. He began a story of Sino, the great wolf spirit who chased the sun across the sky. His voice was a low, melodic rumble, and Sarah found herself stopping her mending, listening in spite of herself. He painted pictures with his words, of star-dusted skies and talking animals. For the first time in months, the cabin felt less like a prison and more like a shelter. When the story was over, Emma was asleep, a peaceful smile on her face. After she put her daughter to bed, Sarah returned to the main room. "You have a gift for stories," she said softly. "Stories are the breath of our people," he replied, his gaze fixed on the flames. "They keep the memory of our ancestors alive." She took a chance. "The men you met with, the white officials. Was it about the new reservation?" His jaw tightened. A muscle flexed in his cheek. "They wish to push us off our ancestral lands, onto the dry plains where nothing grows. They call it a treaty. My people call it a cage. You went to speak against it?" "I carried a message," he said, his voice low, "from our elders, a plea to honor the old agreements." He paused, his eyes dark with a memory she couldn't see. They did not listen with their hearts. The air grew thick with unspoken things again. He was a representative of a people she was helping to displace, just by existing here. Her farm, her home, it was on land that was once theirs. "James and we just wanted a place of our own," she said, feeling a need to defend herself. "A place to be peaceful." "Peace is a difficult thing to find when one man's home is built on another man's history," he said, not with anger, but with a deep, profound sadness. Just then, a loud crash from outside shattered the quiet. Cold Fox was on his feet in an instant, his limp almost forgotten. He moved to the frosted window, wiping a small circle clear to peer into the blinding white. "Wolves," he said, his voice a low growl. "They're in your smokehouse." Panic seized Sarah. The salted and smoked meat in that small outbuilding was their lifeline. It was what would see them through to spring. Without it, they would starve. He grabbed James's rifle from the mantel. "Stay inside. Lock the door." "No," she said, surprising herself with her own ferocity. She grabbed her thickest shawl and a lantern. "That's our food, my daughter's food. I'm coming with you." He looked at her for a long moment, then gave a single, sharp nod. The cold was a physical blow. The wind tore the breath from her lungs and drove ice crystals into her face. The snow was waist deep, a thick, heavy powder that fought them with every step. The lantern cast wild, dancing shadows as they struggled toward the smokehouse. They could hear the snarling now, the sounds of splintering wood. 3 large gray wolves had torn a hole in the side of the small building. They were shadows of hunger, desperate and fearless. The alpha male turned as they approached, its lips peeling back from its teeth in a menacing snarl, its yellow eyes glowing in the lantern light. Cold Fox raised the rifle. Sarah braced herself for the shot, but it never came. Instead, Cold Fox began to speak. He spoke in the Ute language, his voice soft and rhythmic. Not a command, but a conversation. The wolves stopped their frenzied attack on the meat. They grew still, their heads cocked, listening. Slowly, carefully, Cold Fox lowered the rifle. He reached down, picked up a piece of fallen, salted ham, and tossed it away from the smokehouse, deeper into the snow. The wolves watched it go. Then, the alpha trotted over and claimed it. Cold Fox spoke again, tossing another piece even further. He was luring them away, not with force, but with respect. An offering. When the wolves were a safe distance away, he moved quickly, gesturing for her to help. They worked together, grabbing the remaining slabs of meat and hauling them back through the deep snow to the cabin. As they burst back inside, their lungs burning from the cold, Sarah turned to him, bewildered. "What did you say to them?" He looked at her, his dark eyes seeming to see right through her. "I told them we were hungry too. I told them we respected their spirit, but that the woman and the child inside also needed to survive the winter. I offered a trade, not a battle." She stared at him, this man of impossible contradictions. A warrior who spoke to wolves, a man running for his life who stopped to save theirs. That night, as she lay awake listening to the storm, she knew 2 things with absolute certainty. First, the story about the animal trap was definitely a lie. No one who understood animals that well would be caught so foolishly. And second, whatever danger he had brought to her door, it was nothing compared to the danger they would have faced without him. The wolves would have taken everything. They would have starved. She had let him in to save his life. But the truth was, he had just saved theirs, and that changed everything. A week later, the sun finally returned. It rose over the mountains and set the world of white on fire, so bright it hurt to look at. The storm had broken, but they were still trapped. The snow was packed 10 feet deep in the passes. They weren't going anywhere for a month, maybe more. A strange new rhythm had taken hold in the cabin. A life built for 2 that now awkwardly accommodated 3. Sarah woke one morning to find Cold Fox already gone. His pallet by the fire was neatly folded. For a heart-stopping moment, she thought he'd left without a word. A strange mix of anger and disappointment washed over her. Then she looked out the window. She saw him. A dark shape moving against the endless white, a makeshift spear in his hand. He was heading for the tree line. He was keeping his promise. He was going to hunt. He returned late that afternoon, his face flushed from the biting cold, but his eyes lit with success. He carried 2 snowshoe hares and slung over his shoulder a small doe. Sarah couldn't believe it. He'd found life in a world that looked completely dead. "The snow tells a story," he said simply, when she asked him how. "You just have to learn how to read it." They worked together outside in the blinding sun, dressing the meat. He showed her things she'd never known, techniques his people had used for centuries: how to use the sinew for thread, how to soften the hide for mending clothes, how to use every last piece of the animal so nothing was wasted. "My grandmother taught me that we show respect for the life we take by using all of it," he explained, watching her work. "You have skilled hands." Sarah felt a flush of pride that surprised her. "My father taught me some. My mother wished I'd learned the piano instead." His eyes held a flicker of amusement. "You are a woman who walks between 2 worlds. Like me." "I suppose I am," she said, thinking about it. Too rough for the society she'd left back east. Too refined for some of the hard people out here. "It is a strength," he said, "to see both sides." As they worked, the silence between them finally began to thaw. She told him about her life in Pennsylvania, about meeting James, about their dream of building a homestead. He listened, truly listened, with an intensity that made her feel seen for the first time in a long, long time. In return, he spoke more of his people. He told her about the wound on his leg. "It was not an animal trap," he said, his voice low and serious. "It was from a man trap, set on a trail used by my people. Steel jaws, meant to snap a man's leg." Sarah stopped what she was doing, the blood draining from her face. "Who would do such a thing?" "Someone who does not want us to travel these mountains," he said. "The same men who want our land. They hired men to watch the trails, to discourage us." He told her the rest of the story. He had been chosen by his elders to deliver a pouch to an army captain at Fort Garland. Not just a plea, but proof. Old maps, signed by government surveyors from years before, that clearly marked the mountains as Ute territory. The proof was undeniable. It would ruin the land baron, Silas Croft, who was trying to seize the territory. "Croft's men found me 2 days before the storm hit," he said. "I was ambushed. They did not see me, but they knew I was coming. The trap was for me. I managed to get free, but they shot at me as I ran." He paused, and his eyes met hers. "They shot at me with a rifle, and I believe they are still looking for me, and for the maps." Suddenly, the isolation of the cabin no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a cage. They were trapped here, with men ruthless enough to set man traps and shoot a person in the back. And those men were hunting him. A cold dread washed over Sarah. "The maps. Do you still have them?" Cold Fox nodded slowly. He reached inside his shirt and pulled out a worn leather pouch, sealed with resin to be waterproof. "They are the future of my people. I cannot let Croft get them." That night, the reality of their situation settled in. This wasn't just about surviving the winter anymore. They were caught in the middle of a war over the land her cabin was built on. A war with a man named Silas Croft, who was willing to kill to get what he wanted. As Sarah lay in bed, with Emma sleeping soundly beside her, she could hear Cold Fox by the fire, sharpening a knife on a stone. Scrape, scrape, scrape. The sound was steady, patient, and deadly serious. She thought about James, about his death. It had come on so suddenly. The doctor from the settlement had called it influenza, a bad strain that had swept through the valley. But James had been strong as an ox. He'd rarely been sick a day in his life. He had been a surveyor. He knew these mountains better than anyone. He had been mapping the very territory Silas Croft wanted. A terrible, sickening thought began to form in her mind. A dark suspicion that felt like poison. What if it wasn't influenza that killed her husband? The thought was so monstrous she tried to push it away, but it wouldn't go. It clung to her, a cold shadow in the warm cabin. James had been mapping this land. He must have known about the old boundaries, the ones that proved it belonged to the Ute. What if he'd discovered what Croft was up to? James was an honest man. He would have tried to report it. She sat bolt upright in bed, her heart pounding. She had to know. The next morning, she told Cold Fox she was looking for some of James's old wool blankets in the small, dusty loft above the main room. He offered to help, but she insisted she could do it herself. She needed to be alone. She climbed the rickety ladder, her hands shaking. James's things were packed away in a large wooden trunk. His clothes, a few books, his tools. She dug past them, her fingers searching for the familiar feel of his leather work satchel. She found it at the very bottom. She pulled it out, her breath catching in her throat. This satchel had gone everywhere with him. He'd been carrying it the day he came home sick, shivering and pale. He'd collapsed right after setting it down. She opened the buckles. Inside were his maps, his compass, his pencils, and tucked away in a side pocket, his journal. She'd never read it. It felt too private, too painful. But now, she opened it with a desperate urgency. She flipped through pages of survey notes, calculations, and sketches of the landscape. Then she found it. The last few entries. Her blood ran cold as she read James's elegant, familiar script. October 12th, 1875. Met with Barlow, Croft's foreman, today. He seems amicable, but his questions about the old survey lines were pointed. He offered a generous sum for my survey records of the North Range. I declined. Something is not right here. October 14th. I have found it. An old boundary marker, exactly where the Ute claimed it would be. The original government survey is correct. Croft's entire claim on this territory is fraudulent. He has falsified documents. This is grand larceny on a massive scale. I must report this to the magistrate in Denver. October 16th. Barlow visited again. He was not so friendly this time. He knows what I've found. He made a veiled threat against Sarah and Emma. God help me, what have I stumbled into? I will hide my findings. I will pretend I found nothing. I have to protect my family. The final entry was just 2 days before he died. October 19th. Barlow brought a bottle of whiskey to celebrate the end of my survey. A peace offering, he said. We shared a drink. I feel unwell. A strange fire in my belly. My head is swimming. This is no flu. The writing trailed off into an illegible scrawl. Sarah's hands flew to her mouth, stifling a scream. It wasn't influenza. It was poison. They had murdered her husband. Barlow, Croft's foreman, had sat in her cabin, shared a drink with her husband, and poisoned him to keep him quiet. She felt a wave of nausea and rage so powerful it almost knocked her over. They hadn't just taken her husband. They had sat at her table and done it with a smile. The grief she had carried for months curdled into a hard, cold fury. She scrambled through the satchel, her fingers clumsy with adrenaline. Tucked into a false bottom James must have built, she found it. A separate, hidden sheaf of papers. It was James's evidence. His copy of the original survey map, notes detailing Croft's fraud, and a sworn affidavit he must have been preparing to send. He hadn't been a victim. He had been a threat, and they had eliminated him. She came down from the loft, her face a pale, determined mask. She walked over to Cold Fox, who was teaching Emma how to carve a small bird out of a piece of scrap wood. She held out the journal and the hidden maps. My husband didn't die from influenza, she said, her voice shaking with contained rage. He was murdered. By the same men who are hunting you. Cold Fox looked from the papers in her hand to the fury in her eyes. He took them, his expression grim as he recognized the name Barlow in the journal. He saw the map, so similar to the one he carried in his own pouch. In that moment, their separate fights became one. His mission to save his people, and her quest to avenge her husband. They were no longer just a widow and a warrior seeking shelter. They were partners, and they were going to bring these men to justice. But they both knew justice wouldn't come easy. Barlow and his men were still out there. They thought Cold Fox was dead or dying. They thought James's secret had died with him. They were wrong. But they would be coming back to make sure. The cabin was no longer a home. It was a fortress. And the siege was about to begin. The quiet days were over. A new, tense energy filled the cabin. Every creak of the logs, every howl of the wind, sounded like a threat. They knew Barlow would be back. Men like that didn't leave loose ends. They would come to see if the Ute warrior had made it to the cabin, to see if the widow and her child knew anything. They would come to silence them for good. "We cannot stay here," Sarah said, pacing the small room. "As soon as a path is clear, we have to get to Fort Garland. With this." She slapped the leather pouch containing her husband's journal and Cold Fox's maps. "The path will not be clear for weeks," Cold Fox said, his voice a low rumble. He was checking the action on James's rifle, his movements economical and precise. "And they will come before then. They will see the smoke from our chimney. They will know someone is alive in this cabin." He was right. The very thing keeping them alive, the fire, was also a beacon, signaling their presence to the men hunting them. "Then we fight," Sarah said, the words tasting strange in her mouth. She was a farmer's wife, a mother. But the woman who had cried for her husband was gone, replaced by someone cold and hard and full of rage. "This is my home. They will not take anything else from me." A look of respect, almost admiration, crossed Cold Fox's face. "We will not fight like them. We will fight like the mountain. We will use what the land gives us." And so, the work began. They were no longer just surviving. They were preparing for war. Cold Fox was the general, and Sarah was his most dedicated soldier. He taught her the art of the unseen. They packed snow against the outside walls of the cabin, reinforcing them, making them thick enough to stop a bullet. They boarded up the single, small window in the back, leaving only the front window and small peepholes he carved near the floor, low enough to see approaching feet without being seen. He took her out into the blinding white, into the silent woods surrounding the cabin. He showed her how to build deadfalls, heavy logs propped up with a trigger mechanism. He showed her how to weave snares from dried sinew that wouldn't catch a rabbit, but would catch a man's foot, pulling him off balance. He showed her where to dig pits, hidden under a light covering of snow, deep enough to trap a man and his horse. He turned the beautiful, peaceful forest around her home into a deadly maze. Sarah was a quick study. The grief that had weighed her down for months was channeled into a sharp, focused anger. As she helped him set a trap, her hands raw from the cold and the rough rope, she found herself telling him about James. "He was a good man," she said, her voice quiet. "He believed in rules, in the law. He thought if he just showed them the proof, they would listen." "Some men do not listen to paper," Cold Fox replied, his eyes dark. "They listen only to steel." They worked from sunrise to sunset, a silent, efficient team. In the evenings they would sit by the fire, planning. They were two people from different worlds, a Ute warrior and a settler's widow. But they understood each other perfectly. They were both fighting for their homes, for their futures, for the memory of those they had lost. Emma was their anchor to the world that had existed before. She was mostly oblivious to the grim preparations, seeing it as a new kind of game. She would watch Cold Fox carve the trigger for a trap, her head tilted in curiosity. She would hand Sarah the strips of cloth she was using to reinforce the door hinges. Her innocence was a fragile, beautiful thing in the midst of their deadly work, a reminder of what they were fighting to protect. One evening, Cold Fox produced a small pouch from his belongings. It was filled with a dark, sticky substance. "What is that?" Sarah asked. "Pitch," he said. "From the pine trees. We will need it." He didn't explain further, and she didn't ask. She trusted him completely now. His world of hunting and tracking and survival was now her world. Days turned into a week. The traps were set. The cabin was a bunker. The rifle was clean and loaded, and James's old hunting knife was sharp. All they could do now was wait. The waiting was the hardest part. The silence stretched their nerves thin. Sarah found herself holding her breath, listening. Was that the wind, or was it the crunch of a boot on snow? Was that a branch snapping, or was it a twig trigger on a snare? Then, one bright, cold afternoon, it happened. Cold Fox was standing by the front window, staring out at the tree line. He had been standing there, motionless, for almost an hour. "They are here," he said, his voice so quiet she almost didn't hear it. Sarah's heart leaped into her throat. She ran to one of the low peepholes and looked out. At first, she saw nothing but snow and trees. Then she saw them. 3 figures on horseback, moving slowly out of the forest, their dark shapes stark against the white. They were still a long way off, but they were coming directly toward the cabin. "It is them," Cold Fox confirmed. 3 men. The one in the lead is Barlow. Sarah's hand went to the hunting knife tucked into her belt. Barlow. The man who had smiled at her. The man who had murdered her husband. He was here. He was riding toward her home as if he had every right in the world. "Emma," she said, her voice steady and calm, betraying none of the terror and rage churning inside her. "I need you to play a hiding game. Remember the little cupboard under the stairs? I want you to go in there and be as quiet as a mouse until I come and get you. Can you do that for me?" Emma nodded, her eyes wide. She knew this was a different kind of game. She hugged Sarah tightly, then scurried to the small, dark space and pulled the door shut. Sarah turned back to Cold Fox. He had the rifle in his hands. He looked at her, his dark eyes asking a silent question. "Are you ready?" She picked up the heavy iron poker from the fireplace. She nodded. She was ready. The 3 riders came on slowly, cautiously. They were still too far away for a clean shot. They stopped about 200 yards from the cabin, conferring among themselves. Barlow was a big man, broad in the shoulders, wrapped in a thick buffalo coat. Even from this distance, Sarah could feel the menace radiating from him. "They see the smoke, but no tracks," Cold Fox murmured from the window. "They are confused. They expected to find an empty cabin or a frozen body." One of the men dismounted and began to walk forward, his rifle held ready. He was testing the ground, moving slowly, deliberately. "He is the scout," Cold Fox said. "Let him come." They waited. The silence was absolute. The man kept coming, his boots crunching in the snow. He was getting closer and closer to the line of snares they had set. 50 yards, 40 yards, 30. Then, with a sudden jerk, his foot vanished into the snow. He cried out in surprise and pain as the sinew snare tightened around his ankle, pulling him off balance. He fell hard, his rifle flying from his hands. From the cabin, Cold Fox fired. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space. The man on the ground screamed, clutching his shoulder. He wasn't dead, but he was out of the fight. Barlow and the other man immediately spurred their horses, charging toward the cabin, firing their rifles as they came. Bullets slammed into the log walls, splintering the wood. Sarah dropped to the floor, her heart pounding. "Stay down!" Cold Fox yelled. He fired again, forcing them to take cover behind a thicket of pine trees. The siege had begun. They were pinned down 100 yards away. But they were 2 against 1 armed man, and they had the shelter of the cabin. For now, it was a stalemate. Hours passed. The sun began to dip toward the mountains, painting the snow in shades of orange and purple. The wounded man's moans had stopped. He had either passed out or died from the cold. "They will wait for dark," Cold Fox said. "They will try to rush the cabin or set it on fire." Set it on fire. The thought terrified Sarah. Her home, her world, going up in smoke. "The pitch," she said, suddenly understanding. He nodded. "We will give them a fire they do not expect." Under the cover of growing darkness, they worked quickly. They had 1 flask of James's lamp oil left. Cold Fox took a half-dozen of Sarah's empty preserving jars. He stuffed rags into each one, then poured in a mixture of the oil and the sticky pine pitch. He had created crude, throwable firebombs. As night fell, a deep, moonless dark settled over the landscape. The wind picked up again, moaning through the trees. They heard a noise from the back of the cabin. A scraping sound. "They have split up," Cold Fox whispered. "One is trying to break through the back wall." "I'll take care of him," Sarah said, her voice a low, fierce whisper. She grabbed the heavy iron poker and crept toward the back room. The scraping grew louder. It was the sound of a knife, trying to pry the logs apart. She stood by the wall, every muscle tense, the poker held like a club. The scraping stopped. A single log was pushed inward, creating a small, dark hole. A moment later, a hand reached through, fumbling for the inside lock. Sarah didn't hesitate. She swung the poker with all her strength. There was a sickening crunch of bone and a strangled cry of pain. The hand disappeared. She heard a heavy thud outside, then silence. One more down. She ran back to the main room. "He's taken care of," she gasped, her adrenaline singing. At that moment the front door exploded inward. Barlow filled the doorway, a massive, terrifying silhouette against the snow. He fired his rifle from the hip. The bullet tore through the table, sending splinters flying. Cold Fox, who had been waiting on the other side of the room, fired back. His shot caught Barlow in the arm, spinning him around. The big man roared in pain and fury, but he didn't go down. He was a beast. He raised his pistol with his good hand, but before he could fire, Sarah did something he never expected. She grabbed one of the jars of pitch and oil, lit the rag from the hearth, and threw it. The jar shattered at Barlow's feet. Sticky, burning pitch erupted, clinging to his boots and trousers. He screamed, a high, terrible sound, as flames shot up his leg. He dropped his gun, frantically beating at the fire. Cold Fox was on him in an instant, hitting him with the butt of the rifle. Barlow staggered back, out the door, and collapsed into the snow, a writhing, burning figure in the darkness. Silence fell. A heavy, ringing silence, broken only by the crackle of the flames consuming Barlow and the whisper of the wind. It was over. They had won. They stood in the ruined doorway of the cabin, the cold night air rushing in, breathing hard in the sudden, shocking quiet. The body of the man Sarah had hit was a dark lump near the back wall. The scout lay further out in the snow, unmoving. And Barlow. The fire had died down, leaving a smoking, blackened shape on the ground. Sarah felt a wave of dizziness. The rage that had fueled her was gone, leaving behind a hollow, trembling exhaustion. She had taken a man's life. She had watched another burn. She looked at her hands, half expecting them to be covered in blood. Cold Fox came to her side. He gently took the poker from her numb fingers. "You were brave," he said, his voice soft. "You protected your home. You protected your child." His words were an anchor in the storm of her emotions. Emma. She had forgotten all about Emma. She ran to the cupboard under the stairs and threw open the door. Her daughter was huddled in the back, her eyes wide with fear, but unharmed. Sarah pulled her into her arms, burying her face in her hair, sobbing with relief. They spent the rest of the night huddled together by the fire, the broken door temporarily barricaded with a heavy chest. They didn't speak. There were no words for what had happened. They had faced the absolute worst of humanity and survived. When the first light of dawn crept into the cabin, it revealed a scene of devastation. The room was a wreck of splintered furniture and shattered glass, but they were alive. Cold Fox went outside to check the bodies. He came back a few minutes later, his face grim. "They are all gone," he said. "Not dead. Gone. They had taken their wounded and their dead and vanished back into the wilderness. Barlow was tough enough to survive being shot and set on fire. They knew they had lost the battle, but the war wasn't over." "They will go back to Croft," Sarah said, the reality hitting her. "They will tell him what happened. They'll come back. With more men." "Yes," Cold Fox agreed. "But it will take them time to travel in this snow, and they will be wounded. We have a head start." He looked at her, his dark eyes serious. "We must leave now. We must get to Fort Garland before they can regroup." The journey was a brutal ordeal. They packed what little food they had left, along with the precious leather pouch containing the maps and the journal. Sarah and Emma rode on one of the horses from the barn, while Cold Fox rode the other, the rifle resting across his lap. They didn't take the main pass. Cold Fox led them on hidden Ute trails, paths that wound through treacherous, snow-choked canyons and along wind-swept ridges. It was a world of blinding white and biting wind. Sarah huddled over Emma, shielding her from the worst of the cold, her body aching with a weariness so deep it felt like it was in her bones. Cold Fox was tireless. He seemed to be a part of the mountains, reading the signs in the snow, knowing which way to go, always watchful, always alert. He was their guide, their protector. After 3 grueling days of travel, they saw it. A dark shape on the horizon. Fort Garland. The sight of the American flag snapping in the wind was the most beautiful thing Sarah had ever seen. They rode straight to the commander's office. The man, a stern-faced colonel named Whitaker, looked at them with suspicion. A lone woman, a child, and a Ute warrior, all looking like they had been dragged through hell. "I need to report a crime, sir," Sarah said, her voice hoarse but steady. "The murder of my husband, James Miller, and an attempt on our lives." She laid the pouch on his desk. She spread out James's maps, his journal, his affidavit. Cold Fox placed his own ancient-looking maps beside them. They told him everything. About Silas Croft, about Barlow, about the fraudulent land claim, the poison, and the siege at the cabin. Colonel Whitaker read through the documents, his expression growing grimmer with every page. He looked at James's last scrawled journal entry. He looked at the Ute maps, which corresponded perfectly with James's survey. He looked at Sarah's determined, exhausted face. He slammed his fist on the desk. "I knew Croft was a snake. I never had proof." He stood up, his eyes blazing with anger. "But this is more than proof. This is a confession." He immediately dispatched a full platoon of soldiers, heavily armed, with orders to ride to Silas Croft's ranch and arrest him and every man on his payroll, including a wounded foreman named Barlow. Justice came swiftly. Faced with the undeniable evidence in James's journal and the corroborating maps, Croft's empire crumbled. His men, including a badly burned and captured Barlow, turned on him, confessing to everything in exchange for lighter sentences. Silas Croft was tried for fraud, conspiracy, and the murder of James Miller. He was found guilty and sentenced to hang. The Ute land was protected. The old treaties were honored, thanks to the proof Cold Fox had risked his life to deliver, and the evidence James had given his life to uncover. In the aftermath, Sarah and Emma stayed at the fort for several weeks, recovering. Sarah gave her official testimony, her clear, unwavering account sealing Croft's fate. She had found justice for James. Cold Fox was hailed as a hero by his people. He had completed his mission. He was free to return to them. The day he was set to leave, he came to find Sarah. She was standing on the porch of the small quarters they had given her, watching Emma play in the muddy, thawing snow. Spring was finally coming. "My journey is over," he said, coming to stand beside her. "Will you go back to your people now?" she asked, a lump forming in her throat. "I have thought about this," he said, not looking at her, but out at the mountains. "My people need a bridge to your world, and your world needs to understand ours. A bridge must be anchored on both sides." He turned to face her, his dark eyes full of an emotion she was only now beginning to understand. "I have walked between 2 worlds my whole life. I have never found a place where I truly belong. Until I found your cabin, in the middle of the storm." Sarah's heart ached. She thought of their future. Going back to the cabin. Alone. The thought was unbearable. "You, Sarah Miller," he said, his voice soft. "You are also a person of 2 worlds. You have the strength of the mountains and a heart that understands justice. Your daughter has the courage of a warrior." He took a deep breath. "Our path brought us together. Perhaps we are meant to walk the rest of it together, to build a new home, not in one world or the other, but one that stands between them." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes, tears not of grief, but of a new, unexpected hope. She looked at this man who had saved her, who she had saved in return. They had been forged into something new in the fires of that terrible winter. A family. "Mama, look!" Emma shouted, running up to them. She held out her hand. In it was a small green shoot, pushing its way up through the last of the snow. Spring is here. Sarah looked from the green shoot in her daughter's hand to the steady, hopeful eyes of Cold Fox. She smiled, a true, real smile that reached her eyes for the first time in almost a year. "Yes, sweetheart," she said, taking his hand. "Spring is finally here." They had survived the winter. They had found justice. And now, under the warm Colorado sun, they were ready to begin their new life. A family born from a storm, ready to build a bridge to a future they would create together. If you enjoyed this story of survival, justice, and unexpected love, please hit that like button and subscribe for more tales from the untamed West. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and what part of their story moved you the most. Thank you for watching.